So my name is Marcia Wallace. I'm currently the CAO with the County of Prince Edward, a vibrant economic community with a lot of tourism, population about 25,000. Before I took this job, which was a couple of months before COVID, I was 20 years with the province of Ontario, most recently the Assistant Deputy Minister with the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing. So I've seen firsthand, the aspirational goals that we have in infrastructure and climate change, and then the challenges it is on the ground in terms of trying to make this happen. And I think we've got an interesting conversation with our speakers today here to start to talk about some of that social resilience that's going to take to get from here to there. We're going to start with Matti, who's Matti Siemiatycki, the interim director and Canadian Research Chair with the School of Cities at the University of Toronto. His work focuses on delivering large-scale infrastructure projects, evidence-based infrastructure investment decisions, and the effective integration of infrastructure into the fabric of cities. And then we're going to hear from Sarah Burch, who's also a Canadian Research Chair in Sustainability, Governance and Innovation, and an Associate Professor in the Department of Geography and Environmental Management at the University of Waterloo. Sarah is an expert in transformative responses to climate change at the community scale, innovative strategies for making progress on sustainability, and the unique contributions that small businesses can make to solving this complex challenge. So we've got some excellent resources here to frame this conversation. Maybe what I would just sort of say is that I think what we'd like to talk about today in this part of the conference anyways is the stretch that needs to happen as we look to those opportunities and challenges we all know, I saw in the chat, referred to as coming very quickly, if not here already. Combining climate change, resilience, and asset management. And I think we've all seen the benefits of that, getting out of our comfort zone or moving out of our lane that asset management has brought, bringing the finance people with the public works people to have conversations they were never having before or had in a really hierarchical kind of way, and really collaborating to get to the conclusion. And now when we talk about adding a climate change lens to that, it's the next place we need to be thinking. I think it's really essential that we consider these, and you're going to hear some of those arguments and examples of where that's working through our speakers today. But it's going to bring different voices to the conversation, different knowledge areas, resilience and resilience toolkits, environmental awareness, environmental science, equity, different questions come into the mix than when we just look at asset management alone from its more traditional lens. So really excited to see this conversation and where we can head in terms of the new partners and new perspectives we could bring to it from a social resiliency perspective. So I'm going to turn the mic over to Matti, who's going to walk us through his presentation first.
Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. What a pleasure to be with all of you to speak about the intersection of asset management and climate change. This image that I've put up here has become somewhat renowned in the city of Toronto to highlight, I think, the emergence and the emergency that we're increasingly facing around climate change. That this really, if not the first, was a major wake-up call for all of us in this city about what is barreling down towards us in terms of both the scale and magnitude of the impacts of climate change, and also what's going to be required if our cities are going to continue to function. Now, what I want to talk about today is broaden out and think about the current moment as the role of asset management within a context of crisis in general. That yes, we're facing a climate crisis, And that's becoming increasingly understood and increasingly urgent as we understand how our infrastructure responds and how our public assets and private assets respond. But in many ways, we're really in the midst of three intersecting crises. And what I want to speak about is how we understand and how asset management as a practice and infrastructure delivery, planning and delivery more broadly, needs to respond to this moment of intersecting crises. So, of course, it's now well understood that we're in the midst of a public health crisis with the COVID-19 pandemic, and this is having an impact on all aspects of infrastructure. And public assets. The climate crisis, which is the focus of this conference, is increasingly coming into focus and is now not something that's theoretical and down the road, but something that is upon us. And we can think of flooding in this region. We can think of forest fires that we've had in this province and across the country and internationally. And all sorts of other signs that the climate crisis is upon us. So that's two crises, and the third crisis is a crisis of inequality and systemic racism, and in particular anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, anti-Asian racism, and all sorts of dynamics that are playing out in our physical spaces, and that in many ways have infrastructural dynamics to them and connections with the way that that public assets have been, and public infrastructure has been provided, and public infrastructure has been maintained. And the image I put up here is protests around the Flint water crisis, which was a crisis of the way that the water system in a city in Michigan was being maintained or not maintained, and a crisis of lead poisoning that disproportionately impacted Black residents in that city, and just gets you thinking and understanding that asset management and the way that public infrastructure is provided is not equal across our landscapes, and the impacts of climate change are not equal across our landscapes, nor are the impacts of this public health crisis with the COVID-19 pandemic. So I think the key then is to understand the intersections of these three crises, and then to think through what a response looks like that challenges or that addresses COVID-19 and future pandemics, that addresses climate change in a context of building more equitable, sustainable, and just communities. So how then can asset management respond? I mean, you see these ideas of the ways in which asset management is fundamental to the response to each of these intersecting crises. When we think about the COVID-19 pandemic, just one example is to think of schools and to think of ventilation, and how issues of school maintenance and the backlogs of school maintenance stacked up for years and for decades, to the point where in many school boards across Ontario, we're counting in the tens of millions, hundreds of millions, and if your school board is big enough, into the billions. And things as simple as having windows that open and close was not necessarily seen as front and center to some of the quote unquote more important business at hand of maintaining public infrastructure and assets. And yet the pandemic strikes, and all of a sudden having proper ventilation in schools became really important. And there's been some work and some reporting on what proper ventilation can do, and how proper ventilation can address the spread of disease within a school classroom. And it's really interesting to look at how things as simple as having fans in the classrooms that work, having windows that actually open, can make for a much safer environment. And this was the case before the pandemic. I mean, we had seasonal flus that broke out every year that would get people sick, and so we knew that this was an issue around ventilation. And yet, having the resources in place to really be able to make those classrooms safe has only risen to the top of the agenda now as we think about how we return to safe classrooms in the face of COVID-19. Similarly, we can think of our public housing assets, which again have in many cases fallen into a state of complete disrepair, with units in the midst of another crisis around affordable housing, with units actually being taken out of the circulation and out of usage because they've been left to decay to the point where they're no longer livable, and there hasn't been money in order to maintain them. So it's not, in this instance, it's not necessarily a lack of awareness, but a lack of sustained funding and a lack of political will to focus on addressing units that are that are necessary for, in many cases, the most vulnerable and lowest income people in society. And I guess in terms of community housing in this instance, this can be very closely connected with issues of climate change, as what the reporting shows on affordable housing, for example, is that heat loss through these buildings, that poor insulation, water and boilers that are out of date and inefficient, and heaters that are out of date and inefficient, a lack of insulation. All of these issues are an issue for resident comfort, and then also have a knock-on effect on how much energy is being used to heat and cool these buildings. And as the buildings fall into greater disrepair, it becomes more expensive to fix all of these units, and we increasingly play catch up with that. And then finally, the really tragic matter of drinking water and poor and a lack of potable water in Indigenous communities, which has been systemic in Canada, and gets us thinking also just about both the capital necessary to build all of the infrastructure needed, which is increasingly, you hear more and more proposals and to address the capital, but also the maintenance, and having reading stories about infrastructure, the lifespan of infrastructure in Indigenous communities being cut short due to either a lack of funding or a lack of resources and folks to actually go out and maintain the infrastructure that's in place. And so all of this, then, these intersecting crises really get us thinking about, as a profession and as a practice, how asset management responds to these intersecting crises, and the need for sustained investment, as well as data and the skills in order to deliver and ensure that assets are being maintained safely and that money is being well spent. What I'm going to return to at the conclusion of this, and I'll tease this now, is that this is not only a technical challenge. This is also very much a political question, which in some cases then takes this out of the realm of the civil service, out of the realm of the professional staff, and into the realm of our political decision makers. And I think that's an important comment, because much of what I'm going to say are ideas that many in this audience will already know. And the question then is, if we already know all of this, why isn't it happening already? And again, to tease that answer, it's not necessarily on the professional side. It's as much a political question about how we allocate scarce resources. And we'll come to that momentarily. So let me present a few ideas of ways to think of asset management and the ways that we manage public infrastructure in ways that can additionally contribute to both addressing the three intersecting crises that I've identified around public health, around climate, and around systemic inequality and social racism. So first and foremost, I think we can be thinking about assets as an asset management as city building and community building. We can think of infrastructure doing and assets doing double duty, so that they are both delivering their initial literal benefit, especially around climate change, but also really providing social spaces and contributions to the city and to public realm. And the picture on the left is an image of a park in the West Don Lands, now called the Canary District in the city of Toronto. And for all intents and purposes, what that looks like is a park. And yet the major aspect of this park was building a berm to protect the city from flooding. And so the berm cost upwards of $100 million to build, because it had to be built with armor stone to meet all of the climate criteria and to meet all of the flood protection criteria. But the key was finishing it off with a park that is now extremely well used and a key social meeting space for communities to come together and to recreate in a safe and attractive location. So you can think of, the way that we think about building infrastructure can do double duty. It doesn't just have to be something that's put out of sight, out of mind, or we build giant walls to protect spaces in the face of climate change. We can think of them as doing double duty. In the realm of doing double duty, community benefit agreements are becoming increasingly common across the province, and I think this is a really important way of understanding infrastructure as not just the physical assets, but also the human the human resources and the people who are involved in delivering those assets, and really diversifying the cohort of professionals who are involved in this field. Infrastructure and construction historically in Ontario and Canada has been predominantly male and predominantly white, and there really is a push and a need to broaden out and diversify who is working on job sites and who's employed. These are often very good jobs, often well-paid unionized jobs. They're a profession and a career, and I think we need methods and techniques to ensure that there's broad representation in the workforce. And community benefit agreements and other programs through the trades and the unions are promoting this approach to diversifying the workforce. I think that can go much quicker. And finally, thinking about, again, as we build more climate resilient buildings and we do retrofits, thinking about them both from the climate perspective and from the livability perspective. Again, thinking about social housing, just as one example, often the insulation in those buildings has been very poor, and so livability in those units has not been great. So because of poor insulation, and so bad heating and cooling. And so thinking about how we improve the experience for residents as we make the buildings lower energy and a better seal of those buildings as well. So first is thinking about asset management, not narrowly as just maintaining an asset, but also assets as part of communities, both in what we build up front and how we maintain them and by whom. Second of all, let's get analytical. If you think about the sports business just as a parallel, sports is essentially now a data business. I mean, every aspect of your favorite sport, whatever that is, whether you're into baseball or hockey or tennis or basketball, is being monitored at the closest, to the micro detail to understand and learn patterns and trends to then get incrementally better. That every percentage of improvement can be the difference between winning and losing. And the sports, because of the financial value for both the players and the teams that compares between winning and losing, they're spending huge amounts of money on collecting data, with more and more sophisticated cameras, with more and more hiring more and more advanced analytics experts, and investing in the tools and techniques in order to make sense of all the data that's coming in. And I use this as a parallel because by comparison, the asset management business in general and infrastructure as a sector is essentially flying blind by comparison. That we collect data in a haphazard way or at a very high level, and we haven't gotten into the details yet of how you make sense of the performance of infrastructure and how you get truly analytical and importantly predictive about what should be built. And I should say in this regard, I mean, we do have national data sharing, collection and sharing standards, starting with OMBI and now the Municipal Benchmarking Network of Canada. So there is data there, but in some ways, when you look at the data that we're collecting now is kind of the equivalent of what's on the back of a hockey card. in terms of like goals scored, penalty minutes, and assists. And if you compare where the sports business is at now, they've taken that to the next level and are collecting data on that is so much more fine-grained, that allows them to then make analytical predictions that are much more detailed. And I think we could be moving much more towards the collection and sharing and analysis, and to get to a point of being truly predictive about how our assets are performing and what needs to be maintained in what order, by when, and by whom. This brings us to the question about technology and the role of technology in asset management. I think there is the lure, the seduction of technology, that tech is going to be the answer, and that if we just put sensors on everything, we'll have data coming in, we'll have a central hub that's telling us, we'll have a dashboard, and you can basically just do this. You can just have one person in a control room that's just kind of managing from afar. I want to kind of trouble that assumption a bit and just say not all innovation is good innovation. And I put up this picture of the SEALs with the scanners on their heads to ask, like, does everything need a scanner? What is this telling us that is socially beneficial, and helps us understand our world better and make better decisions? And so there are certainly some instances where adding tech and adding sensors will help us understand our infrastructure better. As one example, there are now, and many of you might be using these in your business or in your asset management, there are fleet sensors, for example, that using an iPhone now, and predictive analytics, the phones, in fleets, the phone can now listen to the sounds of the engine and make predictions about when that engine is going to need maintenance, right? So that might be something that is beneficial. Now, the question is, does your municipality or does your organization actually have the resources to pay for that maintenance if what comes back is you need to do maintenance, right? So the sensor doesn't answer, the sensor gives you an indication. It doesn't answer the question of what needs to be done and the political decision-making around how to fund it or how to finance it or how to actually go forward with it. But you can start to see how tech could play some roles. But I think we have this sense, and especially within an industry that is promoting and has all these different players and firms coming up with these new platforms and new ways of inserting tech into things and sensors onto everything. We still need to make sure that we're ground checking that data, and that the data that's coming in is actually of use, and we have both the resources to analyze it and the tools to analyze it, and then the protocols to actually implement what it's telling us. Collecting data for the sake of collecting data is both expensive and not necessarily very useful. A follow-up point is around how we use data, and I think one area where Ontario and Canadian municipalities could really make a leap forward is in becoming informed buyers of asset management services. Much of what gets done is contracted out. So the municipality might be the owner of the asset, but the folks who are actually doing the work, like maintaining or reconstructing, building the streets, is not public workforce. It's being contracted out to builders and contractors who are then actually doing the work. And I think we could be doing much better at learning whether there are differences between contractors and encouraging performance that is both financially responsible and environmentally, the most environmentally sustainable. And there are other countries like Singapore, which have created data collection systems and contractor performance monitoring and management systems that collect data on how companies have actually performed, and then use that data to inform to reward companies that perform well, and use that data then to inform who gets contracts for their next job. So there's a real opportunity here in Ontario. They actually do this within the Ministry of Transportation. They have a system of performance management. I think we could be rolling this out much more broadly, and this could be something that's done at the Ontario scale, because contractors work across municipal boundaries. Obviously, they don't just work in Prince Edward County or in Brampton or in the City of Toronto. They work across, many of the larger ones work across municipal boundaries, and learning from their past experiences and using that information to reward the ones who are good. This isn't something that's punitive. It's rewarding of good performance, and it's identifying contractors who have room for improvement. And you can see just from the slide from the experience in Singapore that as they brought this system in, their performance of the contractors went up because now there was greater accountability. So it's not just collecting data, it's using data to inform decisions. Now, we are making asset management decisions today in a context of rapid change. And that change is coming, some of it by choice and some of it by companies or consumers that are, some of them by companies that are pushing their way very aggressively into new markets, and some of it by consumers who are demanding change or demand, and if not explicitly demanding change by their purchasing habits. And so this is shifting the way that our assets are being used. And in some instances, it's putting onto the public the costs of maintaining assets that are then being extremely profitably used by private companies. Now, I think the challenge for asset management then is to recognize which of these innovations should be publicly supported with public funding for maintenance, and how do we ensure that private companies that are benefiting from those that infrastructure that's in place, how are they and being maintained by the public? How are they being taxed, and how are they being how are they being relied on to fund some of that infrastructure? You know, so we can think of, at one level, we can think of charging stations and who should pay for the rollout of those charging stations and where should they go. We can think of internet, you know, now shifting in some cases to cellular and even for satellites. So that's a whole different challenge of asset management and who should take that on. But also as more people are using delivery services, how are companies taxed who are using the public roads in order to do deliveries? How are they being taxed, you know, to pay for the asset management and upkeep of those spaces? So and ensuring that they're providing their services in the most environmentally friendly ways. So the world is changing very quickly around asset management, and this raises the conversation around regulation, taxation, and change, and the role of companies who often don't ask for permission as they enter new markets. And a final point, just to wrap up then, which circles back to what I mentioned before, is that much of this conversation actually doesn't fall on the doorstep of the asset managers themselves. It falls on the politicians. I mean, probably much to many of your frustrations, whenever a new announcement for infrastructure gets made, I think in the politicians' minds, it's this picture on the left that is kind of like running through their heads. This picture on the left is kind of like Christmas Day for politicians. You know, the idea that you put in all this capital and you get to cut the ribbon on this big high-profile initiative that is, you know, that's just a political winner and makes everyone look and feel good. I think for asset managers, in many ways, you know that yes, these moments are symbolic and they are important milestones for big infrastructure, but the real challenge is the day-to-day type of thing, is getting funding to replace windows, which is not glamorous. It's not, you know, you're probably not going to be on the front page of the newspaper cutting the ribbons on building a slightly higher dock wall, or building a you know, something that or a retaining wall to make sure that or a flood protection facility. Those are much harder, longer term types of investments, but they require day-to-day ongoing sustained funding, and that is much harder politically in our system to get attention for and to get resources for. And so I think as an industry, you know, the climate change dimension adds urgency, and I think has been getting attention. And you can see in the Biden plan, at least, we'll see if it ever gets approved, but in the Biden infrastructure plan, climate change has been a major motivation to do much more asset upgrading and maintenance of what's already there, as well as building new, which is the part that it gets a lot of the political attention. So I think what I hope I've given then is some ideas around what the asset management industry itself can do to improve performance internally, but also recognizing that this has to take place within a broader political context of how we allocate resources between new investments and maintaining what we already have. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Matti. And I think you set us up well, give us a lot of food for thought. And I'm going to pick up some of that in the discussion, but I want to make sure we hear from Sarah. So Sarah, why don't you share your screen and we'll launch straight into your presentation, and then we'll do a little bit of Q&A after.
That's great. Okay. And if you could just let me know that you're seeing my screen.
Yeah, all good.
We are seeing your screen, yeah.
Okay, all good, great. Okay, let's get started. Thanks very much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to this group, and it's been so heartening and interesting to hear about what you've been learning about for the last 3 months. It's been quite an epic ride, and it's really interesting to be here with you at this point. Just by way of background, to sort of situate what I'm about to talk to you about today. A bit of personal history. I grew up in a small town, 45,000 people in Manitoba. So I have some experience of smaller city living in the prairies. And I spent several years in Calgary and many more years in Vancouver, a couple of years in England, even some time in the town of Churchill, Manitoba with 800 people. So my experience of this country is pretty varied. And I've been here in Waterloo for the last 8 years. And that sort of flavors my understanding of how communities respond to climate change. How can they tackle sustainability, and all of the different ways we can imagine transformation towards more sustainable pathways in communities. So I am not an engineer, I'm not a planner, I'm a sustainability scientist and a climate change governance expert. So that's kind of the flavor I'm going to bring to our talks today, and hopefully open up our minds to some kind of more radical visions of the future of sustainability in our communities and how we might get there. But I really appreciate so many things that Matti has said already about the social and political dimensions of sustainability and climate change transitions, and shifting our gaze a little bit to at least bring those on par with the technical dimensions. So let's get going here and we'll see if we can do this in the appropriate amount of time. So to begin, I don't think any of you need, let's see if we can actually advance our slides, who knows? Any new information on the transformation that's already unfolding. I think you've been well equipped over the last several weeks to understand the various pressures that we're putting on planetary scale systems. Planetary boundaries is just one way of thinking through these kind of absolutely macro planetary scale ecological features, like the ozone layer, like climate change, like water. And we are seeing the human footprint, or fingerprint rather, on all of these planetary scale systems. And we have data to prove that we are pushing some of these systems to their limits, after which we enter a really uncertain territory, where it's really difficult to predict risks, it's really difficult to calculate costs, and we have ripple effects through ecological systems, through our communities. And we are seeing climate change in particular, of course, become manifest, as Matti said, right here, right now, not somewhere else at some other future point in time. It's a clear and present danger, and an escalating challenge that has natural dimensions, surely impacts on biodiversity and ecosystems and waterways and forests, but the human dimensions of climate change are very real and not equally distributed. And no place is that more evident than in our communities and in our cities, as we see those effects of flooding, of heat waves, of fires, et cetera, be unevenly distributed across people. So this is the transformation imperative. Transformation is underway, whether we like it or not. There are dramatic changes unfolding, but the question is, how do we trigger, how do we envision, how do we support and trigger desirable transformations towards communities that we want to live in, that create a suite of benefits, including resilience? So those are the questions that I'm going to be asking, and hopefully presenting with you with some examples from around the world that I find inspiring and heartening, and perhaps providing a pathway forward. So this scene is very familiar to me. This is Kingsway Corridor in Burnaby, BC, very close to downtown Vancouver, really. It looks a lot like Brandon, Manitoba, where I grew up. Expansive roads. It's sort of an homage to the car, very characteristic of a lot of Canadian urban development patterns. We have the luxury and the curse of space here. So we have tended to...
Sorry to interrupt you, Dr. Burch. I don't think your slides are changing.
Gotcha, thanks. There we go. How about that? Okay, so this scene is Kingsway Corridor in Burnaby, BC. Wide open streets, not much in the way of canopy cover or shade for people walking, not much in the way of protected cycling spaces. Low density overall with the sort of sore thumb 30 or 40 story high-rise development rather than kind of more compact mixed use development. So we see this model baked into many communities from small to large across the city. And there's so much inertia behind this pattern of development that this is what we have to peel back and move away from, of course, as we make our communities and our assets more resilient to climate change in the future. So I and many colleagues at the University of British Columbia and others work a lot on this issue of envisioning the future. How can we come up with creative ways of thinking about what communities could look like? And David Flanders, Stephen Shepard, and others there transformed that image of Kingsway Corridor into this one. And there's so much going on here. We could just sit here with this image and talk about it, which would be a lot of fun if it weren't COVID times. But just to highlight a couple of things that I see in this image. Of course, the cars are gone. We see compact mixed-use development, protected active transportation, mass transit. We see perhaps permeable surfaces, which don't work in all communities if they're more northern, for instance, but do work in some along the sidewalks. We see more people out on the street, interacting with each other, meeting each other, perhaps local places to shop, work, buy food. Micro renewable power generation. So this is just one vision of a sustainable transformation of that image I showed you before. But what I want to highlight here is a couple of things. This image illustrates how we can create a community that is both resilient to climate change impacts. So there are various features here that would help to deal with heat, to deal with flooding. This also is a lower carbon image. So we're getting adaptation to climate change impacts, protecting this community against and becoming more resilient to climate change impacts at the same time as we get that low carbon pathway. We were also having a whole range of co-benefits for public health. Increased active transportation, of course, improves public health, community cohesion, inclusion, economic vitality and vibrancy in this community. So there's so much that can be delivered simultaneously if we have a holistic vision of what our communities could become. But this also begs the question, who gets to live here and how affordable is it to live in this community? And are certain groups excluded? What pressure does having a community or a neighborhood like this place on the surrounding areas? Does the whole city look like this or just this neighborhood? So my point here is that, it's incumbent on all of us, I think, to consider the way our community can deliver multiple priorities simultaneously and consider who gets to benefit from that transition towards more sustainable communities. Thankfully, visions of the future like this already exist here in Canada and around the world. So we can look to urban experiments, sustainability experiments that already exist to sort of show us the pros and cons, the costs, the benefits of moving in this direction. And that's why I always love to highlight this quote from a science fiction author, William Gibson, you might know, who says, "The future is already here. It's just unevenly distributed." So we can look around us to see the future, both good and bad, things we want to avoid and things we might want to push towards. If we look around the world. So I and my team do a lot of work on sustainability pathways in communities, and we also work a lot with small and medium-sized enterprises. I'm not going to focus today on the small businesses, although I'll talk about them until the cows come home. So if any of you would like to touch base with me on that, that's exciting as well. So let's get into some examples from around the world and talk about what they've done that can help build resilience in our physical and social assets in our communities. So this is one example, Växjö, Sweden. So, I mean, I consider urban spaces, our communities, to sort of be the front lines of sustainability transformations. They're these living laboratories where we can craft and implement experiments that can really fundamentally shape our relationship with the natural world and our responsiveness to challenges like climate change. And Växjö is one great example of that experiment. So back in 1996, this community became the first city in the world to set the goal of becoming fossil fuel free by 2030, only 9 years from now. And since then, they've taken an incredible suite of actions and become what they would call themselves, of course, to be Europe's greenest city. They used a centralized district cooling and heating system. They construct energy efficient buildings with timber wood. Their public transportation system runs on biogas and renewables. They promote cycling, of course, and encourage urban gardening, all right in the city center. And the ultimate implications of that are that their per capita CO2 emissions in Växjö are about 2.4 metric tons, which is just about a quarter of the EU average of 7.3, and much, much less, a tenth of the Canadian per capita greenhouse gas emissions of 20.3 tons or so. And the key to that achievement here is that more than 90% of the energy used for heating in the city and about half of its electricity comes from trees. They have waste from a local forest industry, branches, bark, and sawdust, et cetera, that's used to generate heat and power, not unlike the small town of Revelstoke, British Columbia, which I've spent some time in. They do a similar thing with waste from a nearby pulp mill. So that's one promising example. Malmö, Sweden is another. Thank goodness, we have so many great examples from Sweden. They are proactively dealing with climate change through a suite of initiatives in 2 different neighborhoods, in particular the Western Harbor, which is pictured here. This is a mix of modern architecture and more traditional architecture. It's often referred to as Europe's first carbon neutral and resilient neighborhood. It was a former shipyard that implemented a smart heating and cooling system that runs entirely on renewable energy. And one of the features that I like the most is that they have a waste management system where in each household there's a vacuum section in your kitchen into which you put your organic waste that gets sucked out of that vacuum pipe and into a central tank. So garbage trucks don't have to drive through residential areas, and that food waste is collected and converted into biogas to fuel their public transportation system, which is kind of unusual and pretty unique. So a really cool experiment that we can look to. Of course, we can go closer to home. Vancouver was my home for about 8 or 9 years, and I really enjoy reflecting on all of the impressive things that they've done. I realized that given the climate and the size of the city, not applicable to all municipalities and all communities throughout Ontario, but nonetheless, features of how they've managed their assets and how they've designed their communities are very transferable, I think. So this image, for instance, is located in Southeast False Creek in Vancouver, the Olympic Village, which was built for the 2010 Winter Olympic Games. I always reflect sort of with disgust the fact that I was living in England during the Olympics in Vancouver, and then I moved back to Vancouver just in time for the Olympics the other way around. So I missed them both times. But nonetheless, after the Olympics, the accommodations built here became residential housing. It's a mixed use community with about 1,100 residential units here, urban parks, and a growing number of retail and service outlets. And there's so much packed into this image. There are green roofs with stormwater catchment used for gardens and waterscapes and a children's water feature. There's passive building design that use natural light and natural ventilation and insulation to reduce the energy use of these buildings, organic waste and on-site composting. All of these units are heated by a neighborhood energy utility, and monitoring, to speak to the data issue that Matti raised, gives each suite the technology to monitor their own energy and water usage. So a lot going on here. So these are just 3 examples of neighborhoods around the world that have done lots all in one space to deliver both low carbon development as well as more resilient communities in the face of climate change impacts, and might give us sort of a real world example of how we could get here. So I'd just like to wrap up with my final thoughts, which are that we can do both. We can manage our assets in our communities in a way that simultaneously reduces greenhouse gas emissions and fulfills our responsibilities there, while also building in resilience to climate change impacts. And we can get co-benefits for public health, for public inclusion and affordability if we explicitly aim to achieve those, monitor them, and encompass the costs and benefits more broadly than just narrowly looking at one physical asset or physical infrastructure. Getting from here to there is, as Matti said, only partly a technical problem. It is very much a political challenge and a social and behavioral and normative challenge. So social infrastructure, social resilience is as important as the physical assets that we're managing. But with a whole systems approach, with systems in mind, the full life cycle of those assets in mind, we can really, I think, move into a new phase of asset management that supports a more inclusive, low carbon and resilient vision of community sustainability. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Sarah. So I'm going to try to facilitate a bit of a conversation. Feel free to throw a question into the chat. We'll try to keep up with that. If we don't cover all your questions, organizers have committed, as you heard at the start, to follow up and share. But maybe I'll just start with you, Sarah, because I think you gave some very hopeful pictures of what this looks like when it's done really well. You know, we got a number of people listening in today that either work for municipalities or advise municipalities. How do we get, you said, how do we get from here to there, that systems thinking? What does that look like from a service delivery, sort of day-to-day decision-making kind of perspective? Like when you look at some of these better examples, is there any hints or guides of where to start or what's going to make the most difference in terms of moving in this direction?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would have a couple of reflections to offer, I guess. So the first is, it seems sort of fuzzy and intangible, but I actually do think that the vision is really important. I think our community members and those of us who work in these spaces sometimes struggle to understand where we're trying to go and what benefits and costs there might be associated with going there. And more radically imaginative visions are part of that. And that's tricky. I often, whenever I'm hearing a lot coming out of the media, in the US context, certainly around the Biden infrastructure plan and climate change targets. And often what I hear described is sort of deeply conventional thinking, like we're going to have communities that function essentially exactly the same way, but they're going to be low carbon. And I don't know, I think we can do better than that. I think we can be more imaginative about how our cities function. So the vision to me is really important. But in order to have a vision that we can collectively get behind, more voices need to be at the table participating in designing that vision, because I think there is the danger that those who already have power and influence get to decide where we all go and what sustainability looks like. And I think there's lots of ways sustainability can look. So I think the vision is really important. There is an enormous amount of complexity in taking the first steps towards communities that look like this. And I have to acknowledge there are costs certainly associated with creating assets and funding assets that are ecosystem-based solutions to problems that we used to use or that we could use typical gray infrastructure or hardened infrastructure for. Different folks like ecologists have to be at the table telling us how to manage a wetland, and planners need to work with engineers. And so cross-departmental and interdisciplinary collaboration on designing these communities is absolutely crucial on the day-to-day design and delivery, I think, of these services.
To find those opportunities kind of as you're moving through it. The vision is interesting. Matti, you talked about the politics of this. I think we all recognize that, we got municipal politicians on a 4-year cycle, and yet, climate change needing at minimum 10 to 20 years, asset management needs a long time frame. What do you think influences the politicians? Where do we focus our energies to get them to consider these questions?
I would say in many ways it starts with communities, and it starts with community voices and creating spaces for communities to engage. I think Sarah really beautifully highlighted what a sustainable and inclusive community can look like. I think when we actually observe what has been happening, in many cases, the major investments in public transit, as one example, have also in recent years become vehicles of gentrification and displacement. And I think listening to communities and including communities in the processes of change is critical to getting people on board to feel like as these changes take place, as we try to build more low carbon, sustainable and walkable neighborhoods as examples, that those neighborhoods are not pushing out the people who are already there. And in many cases, the people who need to benefit and could benefit most from the public transit coming to their doors, who have often been excluded for very long periods of time. I think my observation is that politicians respond to these community engaged processes, and our role as on the professional side is to create venues and forums where communities can come and articulate the vision for their communities and an idea around development without displacement. And I think all of the ideas, when you listen and bring forward those ideas from communities, you find new ways of financing infrastructure, you find new ways of developing plans that do allow development to take place. We often struggle with this idea of NIMBYism and the idea that build nothing anywhere near anyone. And increasingly, I think the way out of this is to genuinely include communities in how that transformation is going to take place, and ensure policies around development without displacement, so that both for the types of residential and retail that's being built, that we can ensure that the communities are truly inclusive and resilient.
The combined crises that you spoke of at the beginning of your presentation kind of points to that, because different voices are being heard right now. The question is, how long do they hold the floor and capture our collective attention? And so the point about engagement is interesting. Sarah, is that what you're getting at in terms of the vision being really important? Because a top-down vision obviously is a different outcome than if we're bringing people together who don't normally get heard. And do either of you have any examples of where that's been successful, that to get the conversation going?
Yeah, I think you're right, that a top-down vision, well, I mean, it's a top-down and a bottom-up process, right? They both happen simultaneously. And I think the bottom-up part means, I mean, you all have, everybody on this call has an enormous amount of experience, I'm sure, engaging with the residents in your communities. And you know what works and what doesn't from the time of day that you hold those interactions, who can come to those events and who is systematically excluded, what language do they operate in, what sort of technical background do you need to really wade into these issues, and can that be provided so that we can all be sort of on the same footing when we come together to talk about the visions of our communities. But I would say one key feature, and I've been part of this visioning process in a couple of municipalities in BC, is the vision shouldn't be, you don't want to create new inertia necessarily. You want to have frequent opportunities to check back in. If we're truly doing a whole systems, complex vision of what a sustainable community looks like, it's about our values. Like, this vision is a manifestation of what we value, and those change. That the values change, and the impacts of climate change are shifting over time. So the really frequent opportunities to check in and, is this working, and let's tweak it, let's revise it, instead of locking into a pathway that becomes irrelevant or out of sync with our values as we go forward, is really important.
Yeah, Matti, I don't know if you want to jump in here. Made me think of, I live in a community that has declared a climate change emergency, and that was a good day. And then what do you do after that, right? And the conversation, asset management is already a really difficult conversation to have, and tends to be, because of all the technical aspects that you were alluding to, Matti, that can be really insular in terms of who gets to be part of that conversation and how you have that conversation. So I think what you guys are describing right now is a different kind of conversation about values and the kind of community we want to live in, and to prioritize these kinds of decisions as part of asset governance, that politicians have to make decisions about the budget and which work gets done first and the relative priorities, and who gets to be part of that conversation, I think is what you're highlighting.
Yeah, maybe I can pick up on that. You know, I was involved with the process here in Toronto around the waterfront. I sat on the board of Waterfront Toronto for a number of years in the late 2000s and into the early 2000s and 10s. And at that point, Waterfront Toronto, you know, I think to Sarah's comment about needing top-down and bottom-up vision. The top-down vision was that we were going to revitalize a giant swath of the city of Toronto that is both prized real estate and had been stubbornly underdeveloped for decades and cut off from the city, was going to require collaboration between three levels of government, which, as everyone knows in this country, is often very challenging. So creating a tripartite organization with the municipality, the province, and the federal government all at the table was a piece of top-down leadership to get that collaboration going. But the bottom-up strategy of working closely with communities to develop the vision around how sustainability and how climate resilience should be built into that neighborhood was really important. And it came to a head a number of years ago with when Mayor Rob Ford and Doug Ford proposed a mega mall and a monorail for that area, and in fact, we're very proud of their proposal, which kind of came out of left field. And it was the community that rallied behind it, and showing their support said, we trust the vision that Waterfront had put forward. And Waterfront was getting all of these emails and all of these messages saying the community supports the more sustainable vision of a waterfront that's walkable, that's that has parks built into it, and is a much more of a neighborhood scale. Now, what's interesting is what you've heard more recently about Waterfront is they got into trouble around the Sidewalk Labs proposal, where in many ways the consultation was actually, they actually delegated control for consultation and engagement to a private company. And what you heard from the community in large measure was people saying, we feel like that is the job of government. Private, we don't, the waterfront has been redeveloped through private development. So it's not that we're opposed to private development, but the vision needs to be publicly set, and with the government's protecting the public interest directly. And I think you've seen a change in tone with now how Waterfront is being very deliberate about them putting forward the vision and looking for development partners who will work within the vision that is set with the community and the elected officials setting that direction.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. Who the public interest, something you can't delegate, and also something that people can get their heads around in terms of a role for a politician who might not be, a financial expert or an asset management expert, or trying to figure out where they step in, where's their role. I'm going to pivot a little bit here, and some of the questions we're getting in the chat are around retrofits. And I know a lot of the really exciting examples are brownfields or greenfields, like big open canvases, lots of money, lots of political will, tri levels of government working together. Any examples or advice for more of a retrofit approach? Is there an incremental option here to move the yardsticks?
These are great questions, and I am so heartened, especially on the sort of decarbonization space, but also in resilience. Too often we talk about these fancy brand new buildings, right? The LEED, beyond LEED Platinum, passive house or net zero new builds on a brownfield or greenfield site. And those are great as sort of demonstration projects, and certainly every new building, given the lifespan of these buildings, should meet really stringent criteria, environmentally and otherwise. But the real challenge of accelerating decarbonization and responding to climate change is dealing with what we already have. So retrofitting existing buildings is absolutely crucial, and at a pace that we've never done before. So this is tricky. there is a great example from Eva Jackson in the chat there, and I hope Eva will herself pick it up immediately after our session here. But I also inserted a link to Energy Sprong. There's models that are coming up for how to sort of speed up and bulk buy retrofits for residential buildings, especially if they are uniform, like social housing. If we have sort of one building type that we need to, you know, wholesale retrofit, and we are trying to allow elders to age in place, and we're trying to maintain the diversity of our communities rather than excluding folks by making these buildings so completely out of reach financially. So there are urban, residential, and commercial retrofit programs that are emerging across the US, here in Canada and in Europe, that I think give some really great templates.
Matti, you want to jump in?
I do. I want to just speak a little bit to the financing and delivery models here, because I think energy retrofits are an exciting area where climate and finance can actually come together, in the sense that saving energy actually has there's a financial dimension to saving energy, and that dimension that savings can be captured by someone. It can either be captured by a government who invests upfront their own money in a retrofit and repays that initial investment through the energy savings, or it can be built into a financial product where an investor invests upfront to achieve that, to provide the initial capital to do the retrofit, and then they capitalize on the savings. And I think what we could see is the scaling of this financial sector, where there are companies now who can do this at scale, who have the building expertise and have the scale and financial resources and reach in order to be able to move into this space. And you might start to see increasingly, for example, insurance policies that will wrap the financial savings so that it becomes less risky for investors or even for governments to try to predict what those environmental savings are going to be and energy savings are going to be. We need data and good quality data coming in order to design those types of products. But you know, you can start to see, this doesn't necessarily have to be private led, it could be public led through our government borrowing and institutions, especially at historically low rates, or it could be through you know, some of our major infrastructure investors like our pension funds and others. But there are ways of, this is one of the sectors in Canada that actually has a potential revenue source because of savings of money on energy that could then be reinvested into the assets in various ways.
Absolutely. And if we're thinking a longer term time frame, as we would be in asset management, then those savings become real as opposed to an annual budget kind of lens. Yep. So we've been talking a lot about buildings assets, but what about linear assets? Because we've got a lot of municipal focus right now. We've got a little reprieve with another year on our asset management plans in the sector, but there's a lot of roads and bridges and pipes and, you know, a lot of linear work that is going to be kind of baked in terms of plans as a result of the provincial requirements. Any advice that, you know, Matti, your metaphor for the hockey card was popular in the chat. And I think, Sarah, you're talking about different people coming to the table and designers and different things. As we start to look in the municipal sector at our fine tuning our multi-year capital plans and thinking about linear assets, any advice on from some of the better examples about who should be at the table that isn't, or what data we should be collecting that we're not? Kind of where would you advise the sector, given that's our primary focus for many of us?
Matti, do you want to?
Oh, sure. I was going to ask if you wanted to go first, but I'll start. I mean, this is just hard work. I mean, we've seen, you know, to convince people that the annual maintenance of a piece of infrastructure is both necessary and a worthwhile place to spend money, when there's all these more high profile and instant gratification places for building new is not easy. And this has been, you know, there's if anyone's interested, there's an amazing John Oliver piece from This Week Tonight on infrastructure, which is just gets at this question of how you convince people to invest in maintenance. And I think that this sector has really struggled with how you convince people that investing in something today that may not break tomorrow, it may not break next week, but if it breaks, in a year or 10 years or 20 years, is going to be catastrophic, has been really challenging. I think data, it can be key here to tell the story and to be able to really systematically say that if, we've often used assumptions about what's going to happen. Like if you don't maintain this piece of infrastructure in 5 years, it might break. I think we could be collecting data that shows how these infrastructure really break down over time and give and tell the story, or how flooding will impact if, for example, how flooding could multiply and magnify if our infrastructure is not maintained. So those are and I think trying to use visualization better and use analytics in a more compelling way, I think might be one way to build a narrative around spending on maintenance, which is historically and to the present not been an easy story to tell or to convince politicians and society to spend money in that area.
So you're talking about data that will help make that case in terms of the life cycle benefits and some of the financial payoff or risk if we don't invest in that space.
Yeah, like the tennis court graphic. I mean, that tennis court graphic, if you stare at it for long enough and understand what the different colors are, you can figure out like where it's most advantageous to be hitting the tennis ball, and also where your opponent is beating you. In this case, the opponent is weather and time. And in a country like Canada with pretty extreme weather, that shortens the time span. I think having those types of graphics that in a very compelling way can show you like, this is what's happening to our infrastructure. The maintenance of our infrastructure isn't front page news until it is. And like here in Toronto, for example, when concrete started falling off the underside of the Gardiner, all of a sudden this went from like out of sight, out of mind to something that was really pertinent and relevant. And then all of a sudden everyone's racing down there to figure out what to do about this. That's not the way to do asset management. And I think for us, doing it at the last minute once you're compelled by a crisis. And I think this is, this sector and infrastructure more broadly, how we tell stories about the need to do regular maintenance and what can happen when infrastructure fails, without being hyperbolic, without being fear mongering, which is not easy. But I think trying to tell those stories and using data to make the case, I think is going to be one of the ways forward.
Sarah, do you want to jump in about who should be at the table?
Well, just, I guess, final thoughts on that. I think we're nearly out of time, but I just wanted to sort of highlight how important it is, this communication challenge, right? That the storytelling around the value of these assets, so that folks can be brought along in that conversation, and personalizing the story around what can be very invisible, very abstract, parts of the fabric of our cities, I think is quite important for bringing the residents of our communities along, and ensuring though that as we're making these decisions around the linear assets, as you say, that continues to align with our vision. Are we investing in the right place, given how much these investments lock us in to a particular pathway of emissions and exposure to climate change impacts? And I've often heard planning as sort of driving down the highway with only your rear view mirror as the guide, if we're not looking ahead to how rapidly climate is changing and what sort of surprises we might see and how these costs might escalate. So I think that futures oriented approach to planning for these assets is so crucial to ensure that the costs don't escalate beyond what's bearable.
Thanks for that. You both provide a bit of a roadmap in terms of some of the questions we should be asking ourselves and our councils and elected officials, but also the community conversation we need to start. If you were to provide just by way to bring closure to this and make sure we leave time for Eva's great presentation next, what's that one piece of advice you'd give the asset manager or the decision maker who might be listening here in terms of if they're going to change one behavior that they're doing now that you're seeing is the thing that we should maybe steer away from, move in a different direction? What's the thing you'd want us all to avoid?
Well, I wouldn't presume to prescribed behavior. But I would just say, I would say that natural assets, social assets, and physical infrastructure are all just absolutely integral parts of the asset management equation. So that requires listening to, learning from, and working across boundaries more effectively. And the better we can do that, I think the higher my hopes for resilient communities. And that will lead to what I think is so important, which is actively pursuing, monitoring, measuring those co-benefits, not just hoping that the co-benefits kind of like happen as happy accidents related to our sort of primary priorities, but actively pursuing biodiversity, social inclusivity, affordability, public health, low carbon transitions, and resilience at the same time.
I think this is a challenging area, and what I hear sometimes is people think it's too big to even tackle, but a bigger conversation, a more systems way of thinking is actually going to make many hands make light work. And I think it's broadening our perspective that's going to help us get there. Different data, different voices, and different measurement of different solutions. So with that, I'm going to thank you both for your very interesting presentations and commentary, and the very lively chat that we've all been kind of watching on the side here. And I'll turn it back over to Chris.